Colleen just read for us beautifully, I should say, a story of a rich man and a poor man. Two of them, actually. We hear the story of a man who was rich in life, who becomes destitute in his death, and another man who was poor in life, but becomes comfortable and rich in death. The one who was rich in life has no name, not one that is remembered by the writer of Luke's gospel, but the one who was poor in life does. His name is Lazarus. Lazarus is described as a poor man covered in sores who lies at the gate of the rich man's estate. The rich man is described only as preferring linen with a particular penchant for the color purple. One dies and is rewarded for what we do not know, while the other dies and is being tormented, again, for what Scripture does not explicitly say. Now, the traditional way of reading the rich man's indictment is that it must be connected to Lazarus's pain, that the rich man is somehow culpable for Lazarus's poverty and or his illness. Oh, perhaps he is. We do indeed have a responsibility, even when not explicitly told to do so, to take care of those in need. But to be fair to this nameless man, there is no connection in the text between the so-called rich man and Lazarus other than proximity. Without any further details, the rich man's crime can best be summed up as ignorance. He ignored the plight of one who had less than him, one that he surely must have passed multiple times a day, going out and coming in, one who was right at his gate. And for that sin of omission, of ignorance, he is eternally punished. Woe to those who ignore the plight of the migrant, the unwed young mother, the detained, or the marginalized today. Woe to those who do not see. Now, like its silence about whatever sin the rich man committed that is grave enough to warrant eternal flames, Scripture is similarly silent about whatever virtue it is that guaranteed Lazarus' eternal comfort. Ask anyone in a hospital bed, and they will tell you that there is no virtue in being sick. Ask any of our Tuesday table guests if there is a virtue in being hungry, and I bet you'll be met with confusion, if not hostility. Do you think there is a virtue in being poor? More so than in having riches? If so, perhaps this sermon isn't for you today. But come to think of it, neither is the parable that Jesus just told us. That's not for you either. The parable Jesus tells us today isn't one to glorify those who are poor or to comfort any of us when our bank accounts are depleted with thoughts of angels carrying us off to glory. The parable today isn't a recommendation to go lie in the street of Trump Tower and cough on everybody who walks by. The parable today is a lesson not about what to do in our poverty, but what to do with our riches. Now, the church, like every organization on earth, has opinions about what to do with our riches. Spend them, give them, save them. This church, West End Church, has opinions about what to do with our wealth. I have opinions about wealth. I imagine you do too. I know you do. We think about money. We think about money far more than we speak about money. And today we're handed a parable about what happens when our money remains silent. What happens when our money remains inactive, ignorant of need, and silent? And we're given a cautionary tale of how not to keep everything to ourselves. It's a good lesson here at the start of stewardship season in its own right. But there's more we can say, more we might question, and more we might understand, as is always the case. Tithing. Tithing is a weighty word that usually carries either judgment or all, but usually isn't one about responsibility or understanding ourselves in this situation. For all of our aid, I'd like to offer a brief history of tithing this morning as it is presented in both Jewish and Christian testaments. Like most things Christians think Jesus told us to do, tithing is not one of them. Jesus himself speaks of tithing only in one story that is remembered both by the writers of Luke and of Matthew. Same story, different authors, but only once. And in this story, Jesus notes that the religious leaders are great at tithing the small things, specifically items from their spice cabinet, but who are lousy at sharing the more valuable matters of justice, mercy, and faith that the world needs. In other words, woe to you who are good with a canned food drive, but are ignorant to the needs of justice, equality, and matters of conscience. For Jesus, the act of tithing is the beginning. It's the starting place, it's the baseline that can be criticized for not being enough. It is not the goal of many modern-day stewardship committees hope it might be. Tithing to Jesus was the obvious place to start. Now, if that's all that Jesus has to say about tithing, you may be wondering why some churches and some Christians continue rattling the rich man's gates with indictment that they or we are not doing enough. I wonder that too. As we wonder, allow me to share with you a bit more of the history of tithing, and forgive me if I'm preaching to the choir. The first example in the Jewish and Christian testaments of someone giving 10% of their earnings to someone else is Abraham, back in the beginning of Genesis. When Abraham gives a tenth of the proceeds from a war to the then priest king of Salem, who was known as Melchizedek. Note here the double-barreled descriptor that I used of Melchizedek as both priest and king. This makes the first example of a 10% payment similarly double-barreled as both tithe and tax. And today we think about tithing as what we give to religious organizations, and taxes are paid to political ones. But in Abraham's time, in Jesus' time, even in our time, there are places that lack this distinction between church and state. Allegedly, ours is one of them. But our tax code, like our scripture, has some curious idiosyncrasies. And along with the distinction between giving to religious and political authorities, many of us may also nowadays think of the distinctions between tithing and taxing along the optional/required spectrum. Tithing is optional. Taxes, like death, are required certainty. We think of tithes as gifts, whereas taxes, to use a payroll term, are withheld. But I guarantee you, there are plenty in our own time and our own city who think of taxes as optional, things to be written off rather than requirements fulfilled. And also, likewise, there are plenty of faithful people who think of tithing as required and wouldn't ever dream of making it optional. Tithing or taxing, freely given or required. Again, Scripture isn't as clear as we might want it to be when thinking about our money and our faith, and frankly, what may lead to our eternal comfort. Now, after Jesus, still in the book of Genesis, Jacob comes along and offers a slightly clearer example of a stewardship pledge. In Genesis 28, Jacob promises to give God 10% of his earnings if God protects him. This is a conditional pledge, rather like a matching gift challenge, that God does indeed meet. But Jacob's example of setting restrictions on God's giving preferences isn't one I'd recommend for any of us replicating today. Jesus offers no room for ambiguity when plainly quoting Deuteronomy again in both Matthew and Luke when he says, "Do not put the Lord your God to a test." Matching gift challenges are now out of favor with the Lord. The books of Jewish law, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, are where the tithing starts getting canonized into Jewish practice. Throughout these testaments, we hear of tithes for the Levites who have not inherited any land, We hear of tithes at festivals, to be given and eaten in Jerusalem at, you guessed it, big parties. And then we hear of specific tithes for widows and orphans and strangers that come every third year. In modern-day fundraising language, we might call these three approaches the annual fund, the gala, and a special appeal at Christmas time. Hold on to your checkbooks here. When combined, these three approaches may well equal far more than 10%. And the only time that Jesus speaks of tithing is when he says it isn't enough. And somehow, through all of this, through all of Scripture's ambiguity and through many, many years of history, the capital C Church has somehow extrapolated a norm of individuals giving 10% of their income to the church. You have questions about this. I have questions about this. Is that 10% gross or net? What if I'm on a fixed income? If it's 10% of my earned income and 10% of my stock portfolio or retirement funds income, isn't that double tithing, and can I only do one or the other? Does anyone tithe anymore? Surely you're not asking me to tithe. Do I get a deduction for school tuition? Both kids are in private school. What about the money I give to the opera or to Planned Parenthood or the Salvation Army bell ringers at Christmas time? Can I count that towards my 10%? And then more specifically, what are you going to do with that money, Will? What's West End going to do with 10% of what I give? Or, I love this one, I don't like unrestricted giving. Can I just give directly to the programs I want to support and sometimes give some of the staff a little something extra directly? Again, does anyone really expect that I just hand over 10% of whatever I earn to the church? And speaking of the church, what do we mean by church? Is that West End Collegiate Church locally, or is it collegiate, the whole thing? Or what about the denominations and the broader church? What do you mean by church? And can I restrict what I mean by church and church activities with my gift? Yes and no. For those questions and for many answers to them, there are as many questions as answers. I'll encourage you to join me on Wednesday night around dinner tables when we're going to talk about faith and finance. That's a night for you to bring your questions and play Stump the Pastor with faith and finance. We'll get into all of it. For today, I want to address a more contemporary point on the history of tithing's timeline. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, say when your parents or maybe your grandparents or even younger versions of ourselves or our childhood selves, we went to church differently than we do today. There was a time when you wouldn't dream of rolling up at 11:04 and scooting out right after the sermon because you couldn't get a later brunch reservation. In that time, the worship hour was the beginning of our life at church, not the end of it. We came to worship and to Sunday school, and maybe to a midweek class or a worship service then. And then we had a committee meeting, and maybe to an early morning Bible study or a prayer group. We came on Saturdays to paint the fellowship hall or to cut the grass or to iron the communion linens. We gave of ourselves, we gave of our time and our talents and our treasures. We might have even given 10% of our treasure and 10% of our time and 10% of our talents, which again is more than 10% and more than the angels dancing on the head of the pin, hiding behind questions of is it gross or is it net? And in that same time, not so very long ago, the church itself did more than perhaps it does today. There was a time, in memory, when tithing may have been more required than optional, when churches were the bedrock of the community, when we were the social safety net. And in that time, churches founded and ran schools and orphanages and places for seniors and hospitals and universities and foundling centers, and we housed people and we fed people and we had yard sales to get rid of all of our members' junk, and we ran toy drives to make sure every kid had a present at Christmas. We did it all. Thinking of it this way, it rather makes it look like the more we gave, the more we gave. Like a combustible engine. The more fuel we gave the church, the stronger, better, and more helpful the church became in the world. Imagine that. Now again, that's a church that was in a time that was, not a time that is. This is not the church that we are today, nor maybe the church that we're even becoming for tomorrow. Today, in our modern landscape, we have a whole wealth of charities and nonprofit organizations specializing in all the individual ways the church historic generally took under its wing. So yes, you're giving to the NAACP, or to Save Our Children, or to the Metropolitan Museum. It does count. It does count as giving and supporting of building the church in the world. These organizations matter. They are faith-based and they need our support. And so too does the church. For whatever you may think about what the church was or what it will be, what it is a place, increasingly perhaps one of the very few spaces, where we actually get to talk about all of this. Where else do you go in the week where everything can be discussed? Where we push ourselves to talk about even money in public with people we don't know, in front of other people that we don't know? Where else do we talk about our values? What drives us as human beings? What calls us to make the world we are trying to make? What calls us to live as better people tomorrow than the people that we woke up yesterday? What other place says whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here, and we try to mean it? What other place do you go in a week where someone cares whether or not you belong? Not for what you can do, but for who you are, and is interested in helping you be more of who you are. What other place? This is the specificity of what church can be in a world increasingly specific. Church is a faith-based organization. A faith-based organization where we take as long of a view backwards as we can and try to take an even longer one going forward as we ground ourselves in who and whose we are today. We do this every week because we're bad at it. It takes practice. It takes practice to stay present. And Sundays at 11 o'clock, or Wednesdays at 6 o'clock, or Tuesdays at 6:30, or 4 o'clock, or Sunday school, or ASL class on a Thursday afternoon, there are times and spaces in the week where we remind ourselves to be present and invite one another to be present, to prepare for the world that is coming into being. Today requires all of us, and all of us, to do together what no one can do alone. Why would you tithe? Why wouldn't you tithe? What does tithing mean? What do riches mean? What does tithing mean to you? And what riches do you have to share? Might required for rather than required to offer a freedom in every offering? What shall I give? What does it mean to you?